Okay, it looks like we are live. So welcome everybody to Life Science Live this week. It's me, Bree again, and I'm here to talk to you all about migration. I'm super excited because there are so many cool things related to migration. And a lot of times when we talk about migration, kind of the first thing, at least that comes to my mind, is birds, because birds have those lots of really crazy, lots of different migrations, really long distances. But we talk a lot less about mammals. And so today, we'll get into birds later at another Life Science Live, but today we're going to focus on mammals. And the reason that we don't talk about them as much with migration is because for especially mammals living on land, migration is really expensive. For birds, they're able to rely on like the wind currents and just the way that air flows in order to save a lot of energy by migrating. For some species of birds, like the albatross, for example, the currents coming up off the ocean, the air coming up off the ocean, allows them to just kind of glide and not use almost any energy at all. They can get really far and hardly use any energy. But for mammals who are walking across the land, they have to use their own energy the whole time. They have to walk or run, and they have to rely on navigating through difficult terrain. They might be going up in elevation and down in elevation using all of their own power without being able to rely on air currents that are coming up off the land or the water. And it's kind of the same for mammals that migrate through the water, like whales and things like that. They are able to rely on the ocean currents to get them around, but for land mammals, they don't have ocean currents. They just have to walk. So we don't talk about it as much. And if it's really expensive, it kind of seems like it might not be worth it to migrate. But for many animals, it's the only way to get food. A lot of land mammals are really just following the food. Sometimes they're also trying to get away from bad weather, like they might have a lot of snow or storms or a lot of heat that they're trying to escape by moving around. So we're going to talk about some of those specific reasons that mammals might migrate by looking at some individual species of mammals. And before we get into the totally terrestrial walking mammals, we're going to look at the one kind of mammal that can fly, and that is the bat. So over here, I have a little hoary bat. That is what this type of bat is called, and it's one that you can actually find here in Utah, but you probably won't find it here in Utah because, I mean, if you know where to look, you will, but these guys are really good at hiding. They tend to stay away from urban areas. They like to live out in the forest, hanging out in the trees. They're insectivorous bats, like all of the bats here in Utah, which means they eat insects. And they have this really neat little pattern that gets them their name. Hoary is referring to all these white tips on their fur that make their fur kind of mottled looking, and that helps them to blend in really well with the trees. So when they sit up on a tree like this guy is kind of hanging like this, they'll just sit on a tree and they'll blend in with the tree bark, and they can hang out there for a pretty long time without being noticed. And then at night they'll fly out and go after the insects and then come back and sit on the tree during the day and just blend in and not get noticed. But for little guys like these hoary bats, being in cold places isn't very easy because when you have a tiny body like this, it's really hard to keep it warm. So in order to survive during the winter, they often leave Utah completely. So I have a little map right here. Let me get it open for you. All right, so this, it's gonna load first. This is the hoary bat again. So you can see him hanging out there in the tree with his mottled fur. So this here is the spring and summer range of the hoary bat, the red area. So you can see they hang out all throughout kind of the United States and Mexico and Canada. And then once it starts to get cold, they often go down into South America. And sometimes they'll go shorter migrations, like from north to south within North America. But either way, they don't like to be where it's really cold in the winter. So they'll move from the cold areas down to the warmer areas in the fall and winter. And so escaping the cold, also following the insects. because insects also don't do well in the cold. They're ectothermic animals, insects are, and so a lot of times they'll go dormant in the winter, or they'll just die in the winter. And so in order to have food, the hoary bat has to follow them somewhere where they are out and active and can be hunted by the hoary bat. Interestingly, this also corresponds with the way that the hoary bat finds their mates. So most of the time, hoary bats live by themselves. They're not like one of those bats that hangs out in caves in big groups. They tend to just stay alone until they need to find a mate. So in the fall, when it's time to migrate, they migrate in a big group, and that's when the females will look for a male to mate with. But they're able to wait to actually get pregnant. They'll mate with a male, and then they'll keep that sperm inside their body until the spring. And then the baby bat will start to develop. And so the female bat gets pregnant in the spring and then migrates while she's pregnant back up north to the areas that she likes to spend her summers in. And then the babies are born after she's done migrating. So it's super cool, and they've completely adapted in order for that to work. And then once they get back up north, they'll have their babies, and there's lots of insects for them, and then they'll migrate back down south again. But it's cool because some bats are actually able to decide if they want to migrate or not. So if a bat is in a place where maybe the weather isn't right or the food is still good, they can either just hang out there all year, or they might hibernate for the winter. So some random hoary bats will just decide that it's better for them to stay and to hibernate, and then they'll wake up again in the spring, and then they didn't have to migrate at all. Some bats are weird though, and they'll, instead of like migrating just straight north to south, they'll go in like all over the place and try to find the best places to have food. So there was one study where they put a GPS tag on a bat, and it moved in like a big circle from California up to Oregon, over to Nevada, and then back to California in a single month. So that's over 600 miles of just flying around. And the scientists weren't really sure exactly why that was good for the bat, but bats know what they're doing, and the bat survived. So it was able to find the food and the shelter and temperature, climate that it needed that was best for that bat in that year. So migrating obviously comes with a lot of dangers for flying animals, including flying mammals. And one of the biggest ones is wind turbines. So those big windmills that we see, they can be really dangerous to bats because the end of the windmill arms is going so fast that the bats will fly into it and then die. And sometimes scientists also think that they might be mistaking like that big tall pole for a good place to roost, and so they think the bats might be flying towards it looking for somewhere to hang out during the day, and then they get hit by the turbine arms. And so if you're interested in helping animals, one really good thing to research someday might be to look at how to make wind turbines more friendly to bats and birds. Because renewable energy is good, and we definitely want that, but they also cause a lot of problems with migrating flying animals. So it's an area that definitely needs some work. So wings, in general, are really good for migration, like we've said, but let's move on to those non-winged mammals. And one of the biggest groups of mammals that migrate are ungulates. So ungulate is a word that means hoofed mammal, and so I'm actually standing here in front of these elk. Elk have hooves, they're ungulates. We also have sheep and goats and deer and caribou. We'll talk about both of those. Bison are ungulates, horses are ungulates, and a lot of these mammals out in the wild, they'll migrate. A lot of them, and most of that is because ungulates are herbivores and they have to eat plants. And just like how insects have sort of times of year where there's more of them and less of them, plants are also out more, obviously, when it's warm and they can grow and they have water. In the winter or in a really dry summer, there might not be so many plants. And so ungulates, depending on where they live, might have to migrate in order to follow those plants. And one of the biggest groups of, well, the very biggest group actually here in the United States, the lower 48 states that migrates, is mule deer. So right over here, this is a set of mule deer antlers. So you can see next to the elk behind me, I'll just kind of show you. So oh, it's off the screen. Let's turn. Boop. Okay, so elk are gigantic. Mule deer are a little bit smaller. Here's kind of like a size comparison. So this is a pretty big set of mule deer antlers, but next to the elk, they're quite a bit smaller. And you've probably seen them if you live here in Utah, because mule deer are some of the most common ones, are the most common deer that you'll find around in Utah. I'll show you a picture too of a mule deer. There we go. So this guy, the mule deer, has the longest migration of any terrestrial mammal in North America, in the United States, I should say, sorry. In the lower 48 states, it's the mule deer, he wins. So there's one group of mule deer up in Wyoming that goes over 150 miles and sometimes over 200 miles in one direction every year, which is crazy, especially for there we go. And so you can see this purple line right here was 1 year, and then the orange line was another year. So they put a GPS tag on a mule deer. It was mule deer number 255, according to this study. And they tracked him moving up from the desert all the way up here to the mountains over there in Idaho. So why do they do that? So the biggest reason is that the mule deer is following food, like we said. So in the winter, snow is covering the mountains, and it makes it really hard to get at the plants underneath the snow. So the mule deer will spend their winters down in the lower areas, down in the desert, where there's not so much snow on the ground, and they'll eat a lot of sagebrush and things like that that are sticking up and easy to access there in the winter. Then as the snow starts to melt, it'll start at the lower elevations, and the snow will kind of melt its way up the mountain, and the mule deer will follow that melting snow all the way from the desert up into the mountains. And it happens here in Utah too, and all over the United States, where the mule deer are watching the snow melt and just following it up, eating that green vegetation as it's growing from the new snow melt. And so the spring migration of deer is pretty slow and gradual from spring through the summer, where they're just moving up into the mountains. Then in the fall, before it snows again, the mule deer will hurry back down, and they'll get back down to those lower elevations because they're not following the snow melt anymore, so they can go as fast as they want. And sometimes, like with this herd of mule deer, they actually found that they went from the mountains back down to the desert in about a week. So it's a crazy fast migration, just all moving back down to where they can eat those sagebrush again during the winter. Super cool. And super smart of them, because they're able to have food all year round. And even though it's a long trek, they're able to get more energy that way than if they were to just stay in one place and try to pick at food under the snow. But one problem with these really long migrations is that a lot of the land in North America and all around the world really is being fragmented by humans. So we have a lot of different ways that different patches of land are managed. We might have some private land, jumping away from our map. So you might have like some private land here and some public land here and some federal lands here, and it's all managed differently, and there's fences everywhere, and you might have neighborhoods and roads intersecting. And so for the mammals that are trying to follow their natural corridors up to migrate, it can be really difficult in order to get through all of these obstacles. And that's one reason, actually, that we don't have like big herds of bison anymore roaming the plains, because the habitat there is so fragmented. There are lots of other reasons too, but it's just not as good anymore for those big herds of animals. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do in order to help these migrating animals keep moving and being able to access the food that they need all year. So that was the mule deer down here in the lower 48 states. But up, like near Alaska and in Canada, in North America, the animal with the longest migration in the world, the terrestrial mammal, I should say, with the longest migration in the world, is the caribou. So here's a picture of some caribou. It's cool because male and female caribou actually both have antlers. And like like all the other deer and elk and ungulates in their family, they shed their antlers every year and then grow a whole new set. So right here, we've got some caribou antler. And you can see this is way bigger than the mule deer antlers I was holding, and this is just one. So every year they grow 2 of these. And the male and female caribou will both do that. But anyway, so just like the mule deer, the caribou are following the vegetation in order to have something to eat all year. And for them, they're up where it's cold pretty much all year round, way north in Canada and Alaska. And this group, called the porcupine herd, is one of the biggest groups of migrating mammals in North America. There's almost 2,000 individuals in the porcupine group, which is super huge. And if you can see, sorry, I'm trying to like hold this still instead of wobbling everywhere. So this is Alaska, and that's the little portion of the map that you're getting. This red part here is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is really important to the porcupine herd of caribou, not porcupines. So during the year, this herd of caribou, they start down south where there's some food, and then they follow the snow melt in the spring, following them up into the mountains, and they go to this red part right here. Like I said, that wildlife refuge, the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and that is where they have their calves. So it's a really good place, nice and protected. It's hard for predators to get to the babies there, and so they'll hang out there on sort of the plains up there, and that's where they have their calves. And then, as the spring starts to get a little bit later and into summer, a whole bunch of mosquitoes hatch, like hordes of mosquitoes, and it's really hard for the caribou to stay healthy and not get bugged by mosquitoes all the time. So they actually move because of mosquitoes, which is really interesting. It's not just food. So I'm spoiling our next animal. There we go. So the caribou, they leave their calving grounds once the mosquitoes come, and they kind of spread out a little bit, and they'll spend the summer eating up in the coastal plains of Alaska and northwestern Canada. And then once the snow starts to come and it gets really cold, they move back south. And they move about 840 miles in one direction during their migration, which is the longest terrestrial mammal migration in the world. Super crazy. But it gets even cooler because they're not just affecting themselves. Like, the caribou are not completely in isolation because they interact with a lot of other animals. And one of those big ones that are really important are the wolves. So we're turning a little bit here so I can stand in front of my wolves. Okay, so wolves rely on caribou as one of their main sources of food. So the caribou migration has a really big impact on where the wolves are spending their time. And when the caribou move, the wolves have to move too. So when the caribou are moving south out of their breeding grounds, the wolves will actually follow them during their migration. And so they might not go as far as the caribou do, but they see the caribou start to move south, and the wolves are kind of already a little bit south. And so they go about 600 miles just following the caribou during that migration. And then during the winter, they're able to have access to caribou as food, because it's pretty hard to find food in the winter for pretty much every animal out there. And so it's good to have those, I'm pointing to the elk, but have those caribou herds close by as food. Then, as the caribou move back north, the wolves will follow them, but they don't go all the way to the calving grounds because, like I mentioned earlier, the calving grounds are pretty well protected from the wolves. And so the wolves, instead of following the elk all the way into those calving grounds, they just move around and hunt other animals. And so, because they're spending this spring and summertime, like moving around a little bit, waiting for the elk to come, or the caribou to come back out, they actually end up moving more in a year than the caribou do in a year. So there was one wolf, this one was actually in Mongolia, but some of the wolves here in, like those ones up in Canada and Alaska, move almost as much. But the record setter for the wolf that moved the most in 1 year was a wolf in Mongolia who moved 4,000 miles within 1 year, just between following his food during migration and then also moving around during the summer. roaming and looking for food. So it's pretty crazy how much an animal has to move in order to find that food. But they do it in a way that makes sure that they're not using more energy than they're getting. And migration just happens to be the way that's most effective for that. So those wolves up in Canada and Alaska, following the caribou is the best way to ensure that they have food all year round. And that was our last migrating mammal. There are a whole bunch of other ones and they're super cool, so I definitely encourage you guys to go out and see what else you can learn about migrating mammals. And I believe it's next week we'll be talking about migrating birds, which also have some pretty crazy and amazing things going on there. So we'll see you next week. If you have any questions left over, go ahead and leave them in the comments, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.